unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Gary Marcus, who is a professor emeritus of psychology, also neuroscience, a couple other disciplines, and an expert on AI. I think of you now as an expert on AI, but you've written a ton of books. The most recent book is this one called Taming Silicon Valley: How We Can Ensure That AI works for us. So now you're a policy guy too. And before that, this book, Rebooting AI, Building Artificial Intelligence We Can Trust. Also this one, Cluj, which I put on my recommended reading list for my behavioral class, my JDM class.
Do you know that the New York Times wrote a nasty review of that book, and then 15 years later, The Economist said it was one of the 7 best books on the brain?
Why would they write a bad review of it? I think it's like an incredibly concise summary of so much of what we talk about in JDM. And I think, everyone loves thinking fast and slow, but this is basically a more concise version. And I think it talks about sort of the functionality of these mechanisms. So rather than just simply saying,
it also talks about the evolutionary history of them, and like why are we this kind of funny bag of tricks that is far from optimal.
Yeah, and what's funny about it is that I think we're perfectly willing, as you said in the book, to accept the notion that our breathing system and our lower spine and these other things are kind of local maxima. We seem to be resistant to the idea that our mental processes and our brain is sort of also sort of a local optima.
There's been some shift on that lately because of AI. So when I wrote Cluj in 2008, most people wanted to say humans are optimal and really didn't like my arguments and some other people's arguments saying otherwise. But partly because Kahneman's book became popular, and partly because everybody wants AI to be smarter than people, there's been a little bit of a cultural shift there. I mean, it's fun to have this conversation with you because almost nobody ever asks me, like, you wrote this book about human irrationality, and yet you think machines are stupid. Like, how do you square that circle? And perhaps you will ask me that very question, maybe even right now.
Yeah, well, you anticipated what I was going to say, because if I were to offer up a very superficial view of your intellectual history, it would be something like this. Spent the first half pointing out how limited we were as human decision makers, and now he has a newfound respect for human decision making in light of the limitations of AI. Now, that would be very superficial.
I actually had a panel once with Danny Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, and was a Nobel laureate. Was a friend. I miss him. And on the panel, he said, I can't remember the exact words, but basically he said, humans are a low bar. And I shot back and said, and it's sad that machines still haven't met it. And like that kind of captures it all. Like, humans are a low bar in many respects. So, Cluj was about all of these different cognitive biases, which by now are very familiar, but weren't necessarily as familiar, in 2008. So, I talked about things like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and et cetera, et cetera. We have all these things that are there to protect our delicate egos. And then we, want our own theories to be right. And I talked about some of the memory ways in which we just can't search for negative examples as well as positive examples. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that are poor about human reasoning, but there are some things that are good. We're very flexible. We can think about new kinds of problems and do that on the fly. And right now, machines just are no match for the flexibility of humans, even though whatever they can do without confirmation bias. They don't have motivated reasoning. So, like, it should be possible to build AI systems that are much better than humans. It's just that we're stuck. I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. We are stuck in the regime of autocomplete on steroids. And people are just so excited about those systems that they're not thinking about alternative solutions that might actually be better than people. They're better at certain limited things like giving you factoids and stuff like that, but they're not really better reasoners than people.
Well, I think I see your work as actually a part of a continuous whole where currently you're focusing on what you call the gullibility gap, right? Which is our overestimation of the abilities of artificial intelligence. And
Right,
I
that was
see
a
these,
term we used in
yeah.
rebooting AI, and building on work that Weizenbaum did, maybe not even on purpose, with ELIZA in 1965. I mean, that's really what showed the gullibility gap. Ernie Davis and I gave it a name, but what that showed is people could look at a dumb machine and think it was much smarter than it was, and that is exactly what is happening right now at literally a global scale. Like when Weizenbaum talked about it, there was a couple people at MIT who happened to get to use ELIZA. Now it's everywhere.
Well, I think Danny Kahneman said that overconfidence is and confirmation bias. These are the sort of meta biases of humans. And so, your earlier work was really highlighting a different kind of gullibility gap where we tended to overestimate our, human cognitive capacities. Right? So I see the entire work as exploring the situations where we tend to over rely or put too much faith in certain types of thinking and decisioning. And indeed, I think when you highlight the kind of the errors, and I mean, I have to say it, I've already stolen a whole bunch of examples from this book and put them in some of my slides, right? Because they're so awesome. But it's really when you highlight kind of the errors. I mean, that's when you really understand the mechanisms. Like you don't really understand the mechanisms when they're working well. And so, I mean, by highlighting all of the shortfalls, that's really where you find out like where the improvement needs to be, right?
If you really want to go deep on my career, you could go all the way back to my dissertation. And it was about how children learn language. And it was in particular about a set of errors called overregularization errors. And this is work
It was in the
that I did with
algebraic mind, right?
no, no, even earlier. This is, um, the algebraic mind was 2001, but my dissertation was 1992. So I did this dissertation with Pinker, and we wrote a monograph together called Overregularization and Language Acquisition. And it was about these errors that kids say, like braked and goed. And the lesson that I really learned doing that work was that people like to make up theories based on very little data. And that was number one. And number two is understanding exactly why an error happens, any kind of cognitive error, is very informative in order to understand how the system as a whole works. When you see something correct, you can actually typically get that in many different ways. Like you could have memorized the answer, or you could have computed it using a rule, et cetera, et cetera. And so the errors and their distribution, when they happen, how they happen, are actually really informative. And so this monograph that we wrote that became part of my dissertation was about the kind of life history. It was actually one of the first big data analyses of child language data. And what we found was that people thought kids were over regularizing all the time. It was the first thing we found. In fact, they only did it 4% of the time. So already, like just out of the gate, just looking at numbers was like a big deal compared to all of this kind of subjective stuff that people were doing. And then we analyzed neural networks that were the predecessor to today's neural networks and found that they were much too driven by similarity and couldn't really abstract. And that's actually the through line for my career in a way, is looking at people's failure to or systems failure to abstract, and how humans manage to do it, how children manage to do it. And a lot of what I've thought about for the last 30 years was really like already starting to brew in that first work, because it was already looking at neural networks and seeing why they couldn't even model what a 3-year-old was doing.
So, I mean, it seems like one thing you're saying is that our theories of artificial intelligence are kind of stuck in the pre-Chomsky era, right? I mean,
I
prior
tend to
to
think of them more like pre-Copernicus or pre-Newton or something like that. Like there's this great cartoon from XKCD, which basically portrays neural networks as alchemy. You've probably seen it. I used it in rebooting AI, in fact. So, um, one guy has this like big pile, and it's a pile of linear algebra, matrix multiplication. The other one says, "Well, is that your model, your system?" And he says, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, what if it doesn't work?" "Well, you just stir the pile." That's alchemy, right?
Mhm.
And that is where we are right now. Is we have a bunch of little alchemy recipes. Nobody really knows how this stuff works. It's not like there's some closed form equation that can tell you, what's going to happen. You have to run it empirically. You have to stir the pile and you see what comes out. If you don't like it, you pour in some more data and you hope that it comes out better. Like, it's scientifically a mess. It is not a theory. It is not principled. Yeah, there's some things, people know. There's like rules of thumb and stuff like that. It's more like cooking than like science. And that's probably not really fair to people who know the chemistry of cooking. Like it's just, it's, it's a mess right now. And it's not a science. And nobody has a principled answer to any of the things that I've been worried about since the algebraic mind, since rebooting AI, and so forth. I keep harping on that you need to be able to reason abstractly, etc. And people are like, well, I'll just add more data and then it's going to work. That's just hope, right? Hope and hype are similar words. It's just hope and hype. It's not actually a solution to anything. It's not a principal solution. Hey, we're going to add this new mechanism and is going to solve this problem around reasoning or hallucination or planning. All of these things. Like I talked about hallucinations. I may have been the first in the algebraic mind in the chapter on types and tokens. That was 2001. That problem has not been solved. And everybody's running around saying exponential progress. And I'm like, well, maybe on the things you care about, but on the things I care about that I've been writing about since long before there were neural networks or money at stake or anything like that. I just care scientifically. Those things we have made at best small linear progress and really like none. Like we really don't have answers to the questions that I've been worried about my whole career. Everybody's like, Gary, you should be so happy about this or that. I'm like, no, because the core that I identified has not been solved. And if you do not solve it, you will not get to artificial general intelligence, period.
I think somewhere in the book, it was Taming Silicon Valley, you made the analogy to pharmacology, right? Now, I love that analogy because that has implications for regulation, right? I mean, you're just playing around with a bunch of compounds and it works, but you're not really sure why it works, right? Sometimes, which is very different from engineering.
Imagine somebody says, I have a new drug for schizophrenia. And you just put it out to market. And it turns out, in fact, that, it kills people. Like we would think that's bad, right? Like side effect death, not what we were looking for. And that's why we have an FDA process. Because, drugs are fundamentally about scientific invention and they have to be vetted to make sure they're okay. And of course, there have been some, really bad cases, sometimes using off-label or whatever, like thalidomide or things like that. Pretty bad cases. Turns out, if you know what you're doing, there is actually a circumstance in which it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense for widespread distribution and dealing with morning sickness or whatever it is that they did back in the day. And so that's why we have the FDA. Similarly, we have this new technology that we do not understand. I just explained why it's alchemy. And it would be crazy to just completely unleash it wholesale and put it everywhere. But that is what we are doing. And so, we have these systems that we know are covertly racist, for example, making decisions about people's jobs. And, people are using it to transcribe medical interviews and it turns out they're hallucinating. I mean, do you want your medical notes to have like completely made up shit in them? No, but that's what's happening now. Like it's a little crazy that there's no regulation in the United States around any of this. And then you have like the FTC trying really hard to take existing laws that were written before there was AI as a thing to try to like control this wild beast. And it's like, God bless Lena Khan that everybody gives grief because I think she's really doing an amazing job trying to work with very limited tools to constrain this crazy beast. And that's, to tame it, to coin a phrase, to tame Silicon Valley. And the tools that we need are not really there.
I mean, you advocate a system of regulation for various AI tools, something like an FDA that would sort of evaluate the potential harms of these different tools. But I mean, to be fair, we don't have those forms of regulation in place for human decision making, right? So for instance, if you have an automated recruiting algorithm, which has adverse consequences, okay, maybe we examine that. But when we have some jackass who's our hiring manager, who's just hiring all the people who love to play lacrosse, I mean, there's no FDA for that. Why would we?
Well, that's not quite true. So, I mean, we have the EEOC, but let me insert something before we get there, which is there's a deep connection between the technical work that I've done outlining the limits of things like neural networks that are being used for generative AI and the policy discussion, right? And the connection is if AI really worked as advertised, the need for policy might not be as extreme. If it were really AGI and brilliant, and if it had human values and things like that, maybe it'd be okay. Think about interpretability. Like, we might not need interpretability if driverless cars worked 100% of the time. Like, nobody would come and say, why did it fail? Because by definition, it didn't fail. But when you have a driverless car hit somebody in the fog and kill them, which I think happened the other day, I'm not quite sure the details, you want to understand why the algorithm did that so you can have it not do it again, right? It's not an unreasonable thing. Like with airlines, we have the, NTSB to investigate, right? And you get in this situation where if the things are not reliable, you want to understand why. So if they never hallucinated, they never defamed people, then you wouldn't have these interpretability problems. But when this lawyer that I described in the book, there's now been many cases like this, but I described one of them. There was a lawyer from, I think it was Georgetown, was accused of rape. He didn't actually commit rape. One of these systems, I think it was ChatGPT, but I can't quite remember the details, claimed that he had been on a field trip in Alaska with some student and, harassed her. It turns out the guy was never on a field trip in Alaska. I don't even know if the student existed. It referred to an article in the Washington Post that didn't exist. The Washington Post fact checkers themselves went through their archive. They completely made up. So now you do want interpretability. You do want to say, why did this system say this thing that never happened? And nobody can give that answer. That's an example where the technical stuff, because it's so unreliable, introduces a policy need. Now, to go back to the discrimination stuff, we do actually, because it's interesting, we do have the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, and they do have the power to investigate individual cases. And so there is actually very clear law in the United States that you can't discriminate. But those laws are being flagrantly violated at scale, in volume, with these new tools. And the EEOC was really set up to have like an individual employee come with a case where they could really show what was going on. And now you have this as a mass scale. What they need is to be able to subpoena information about how these tools are being used in employment and document whether or not there is discrimination. Surely there is. But that's an example where the existing law covers some situations that are similar, but doesn't cover these. And I'll just give you one more case, which is defamation. A lot of the existing law revolves around intention. Did you know, were you knowingly, saying that when you said that Elon Musk resembled, I'm just going to make up a silly example, resembled a barrel of toilet paper, did you know that wasn't true, right? What was your intention? Of course, I'm kidding. He doesn't really. But a lot of law revolves around that. When ChatGPT says this lawyer was involved in sexual harassment, there's no intention because the systems are just autocomplete on steroids. Does that mean that the AI companies should be therefore exempt from anything that they say? Right? Their tools are getting seen by hundreds of millions of people. They're making, errors very regularly. Should they be exempt because the systems aren't intentional? Or do we need to have, like expert witnesses argue about their intentionality? I mean, I would say they're not intentional, but that's not the issue. The issue is that they're being reckless in using these systems that they know are problematic. They have no formal guarantees. Like when we put up airplanes in the sky, we ask that you give some evidence that the airplane won't just fall out of the sky. But when we have people release LLMs, they're not required to give any evidence whatsoever that the systems won't cause a lot of problems. In fact, they are causing a lot of problems.
But I mean, the advantage here of having a machine making these decisions is that we can subpoena the software, right? I mean, we can get access to the features and the
Well, there's
weights
different kinds
and
of
so forth,
software,
right?
right?
I mean, we can't do it with a human. So if you have a hiring manager who's racist, like we can't subpoena the neurons. We can't get inside this person's head and figure. I mean, similarly, if we see Teslas crashing, right? We can go through the data, identify the flaw in the decision making, and then just push out an update if we can figure out how to fix it. Whereas if we look at all, I mean, all you have to do is spend 30 seconds on your Facebook news feed, and you'll see all these videos of dash cams and all these idiotic people doing idiotic stuff. Like, it's harder to figure out why they're doing all these stupid things. And if we did figure out why they're doing them, like they're texting while driving, it's very difficult to push out an update to all of their brains saying, "Hey, don't text and drive," right? So,
Yeah,
isn't there an
I mean,
advantage to that?
this sparks many different thoughts, but one of them is it turns out that for things like large language models, pushing out an update is actually hard to do in an effective way. So you can
Like a
compare
guardrail.
classical. So you think about classical software, and I don't know if you've coded or how many of your listeners have coded, but it's basically logic, right? If A, then B. That's kind of what computer coding is like. If A equals, such and such value, then do this. If the customer's bank balance is, less than zero, then send a note, saying that they bounced their check or whatever, right? And so if there's a bug, if somebody reverses the less than and the greater than sign, you can track it down. You look at the circumstance, you do kind of like a Sherlock Holmes thing. You figure out where the bug is and you fix it. And then you ship out the update. And this happens sometimes, like iOS, they make a mistake when they ship out the new thing and it breaks the email account and, because somebody had to type and they track it down and they fix it. And they can usually do this in a matter of a day or two, and they push out an update because they see the error in the logic based on the distribution of the errors, right? With large language models, nobody has been able to fix hallucinations. Hallucinations are not a bug in that sense, right? Hallucinations are inherent to the way that the system works by doing autocomplete rather than reasoning or understanding the world. And so there's no like little patch you can put on it, right? We've been having people tell us for 2 years, and really, if you're me, people have been telling you this for 20 years, but publicly they've been talking about it for 2 years, saying, oh, we're going to fix it in a few months. Like, about 15 months ago, Reid Hoffman said, I would bet any amount of money that hallucinations will be solved in a few
Yeah.
months. Well, now it's 15 months later. They obviously
Mhm.
haven't been solved. He didn't give any principled explanation. It was just hope and hype, right? And nobody actually can debug it. And any given hallucination is in fact created by the same mechanism as any given truth that comes out of these systems. So it's all built by the same thing, right? With your less than greater than bug, like you can work on it selectively in a modular system, you can fix it. But the only way you can kill hallucinations is to not run the system. As long as you run the system, you're going to get it sometimes because that's how it works. And so they're not actually fixing bugs. What they're doing instead is they're kludging. So we haven't talked too much about like what that word actually means, right? The book was called Kludge, and it's like duct tape and rubber bands and so forth. So people are duct taping and rubber banding things onto LLMs, like RAG that limits what documents they learn from and so forth. And none of that stuff actually works that well. It was one more thing everybody talked about as a miracle cure, and it didn't work. It's all I've got this magic cure and it's going to be here in 2 months. We just need to scale it. And like, I don't know why the public hasn't caught on to the fact that Silicon Valley just traffics in lies. Silicon Valley says, we're going to fix this in X time. And they've been doing this for a long time.
Like Elon Musk, the
I
autonomous
wasn't going to
driving.
say, no, actually, I was going to say. So when I grew up enjoying technology, people mostly shipped stuff. There was always some that didn't get shipped, but like when Apple says they're going to ship an iPhone, they ship an iPhone, right? But Elon Musk, when he says he's going to ship a driverless car, he's still kind of making that up even now, right? He's been saying this for a decade. And they've run some demos in some small part of California for the last a few months for employees only. But they're really a long way, I think, from actually being able to have a fleet of 1 million robo taxis. Like I look at that notion. I think I just saw somebody say, was it by the end of 2026, they expect that Tesla is going to sell 2 million robotaxis a year. Maybe Elon said that. Like, that's not happening. If you look at all of the things that are involved from the regulatory side, from the safety side, from the infrastructure side. They're nowhere near to doing that. And Elon has missed most of his projections on, many things related to that. I think, he knows how to build a very good electric car, but I don't think he appreciates how hard the outlier problem is. It's a very specific thing, right? The outlier problem is you have, or people call it the edge case problem. You have cases that you haven't anticipated, and the system has trouble. The best example I ever saw of this was there's a feature on Tesla called Summon. In principle, he told us in 2019 you'll be able to basically summon your car from New York to LA or the other way around. And that obviously hasn't shipped. So you can actually, I guess, do this to some extent, like have it come across a parking lot. So somebody did this at an airplane trade show, which was not in the training set. And so is therefore kind of an outlier. And not everything that's not in the training set's an outlier. I'm being a little loose there. But so they did this at an airplane trade show, and you can find the YouTube video. And the Tesla ran directly into a $3.5 million jet. Like, it could easily have driven around, but it didn't know about jets. It's not like these systems are generally intelligent, knowledgeable systems that have like read Wikipedia, watched a lot of videos, understand what airplanes are. They don't. They're like looking for bicycles and pedestrians. And if it's not a bicycle or pedestrian, they often have trouble. Recently came out that they have trouble in fog, or low visibility. And so there's all kinds of problems that haven't actually been solved. And to think that they're miraculously going to be solved in the next, 12 months, and then you're going to, in the 12 months after that, build all the infrastructure to do this is crazy. Another interesting thing in that regard that's not directly about Tesla, but kind of bears on it, is there was this company Cruise, which actually still exists. It's owned by GM. And they had more people in the teleoperation center than they had cars. So they were portraying themselves as basically being ready, and the state of California gave them freedom to operate, and they weren't really ready. And they dragged a woman across a street or something like that. And then everything kind of came out, and people started leaking information and so forth. The Times reported that they had more teleoperators than cars. Right now, given the state of AI, the only way you can make something that even looks like a truly driverless car, no human in the car, work is you have to have people off stage. That's a given for everybody. And Waymo has developed that infrastructure pretty well. It's still not perfect. I don't know, every day, every week, there are examples where Waymos do silly things in San Francisco and get stuck in parking lots and all of this. And they have remote operators trying to sort that out. I don't even think Musk really has given serious thought to that infrastructure. And what people at Waymo say is like, as you scale this, you start to see things you didn't otherwise see. So if you had 100 cars on the road each day, which is maybe what Tesla has or something like that, you're not going to see a lot of the really bizarre things. If you have 1 million cars on the road, every day is going to be filled with stuff that like you never saw before. It's going to be difficult, that you need someone in this infrastructure to do it. There's just I'm just giving you, example. Another example, if you want to get to 1 million, you're actually going to have to sell some in the Northeast where there's snow and sleet. What are you going to do? Sell 1 million of these in Southern California? I'm boggled that anybody takes these numbers seriously. But to wrap up the point, because I went on way too long, there have been so many promises made. Elon has made a lot, but Sam Altman also makes a lot of promises, and he likes to hint at things like, what will the world be like when AI solves physics? That's not even a thing. Like, I don't even know what it means for AI to solve physics. But they put out these promises, and the media is like pretty passive about it. It doesn't really give these people making these ridiculous promises anywhere near a hard enough time.
Well, if someone were to listen to just the last 5 minutes of you talking, they would think that you are this incredible AI pessimist. But that's not how I read you. You're trying to highlight that the trajectory of AI that is based on this premise that data solves everything and that one can learn with a blank slate approach. I mean, this is the philosophy of deep learning, that's fundamentally going to, reach its limits. I mean, this is how I'm interpreting what you're saying, but I don't think
Yes.
in practice, do people really believe that? I mean,
Yes, they
one
do.
of the things I like about the, in the Kluge book, I mean, you talk about how our brain has evolved, and so what we do is we kind of add these new layers, and when we add the prefrontal cortex, we don't ditch the amygdala, like we keep it there. And when we look at the evolution of AI, it's you know, good old fashioned AI, programmatic computing. I mean, this is stuff that you don't just toss it to the curb and rely entirely on deep learning, right? I mean, a good decision-making system is going to incorporate elements of all of the different tools and technologies that we've adopted. So, for instance, if I go to Perplexity, and by the way, I ran a whole bunch of those queries that you had in the book, which gave you bad answers, and I ran them through Perplexity, and they all gave me great answers. And I think it's in part because what they're doing is that they're not they're not relying entirely on LLMs. They're basically saying, "Hey, we're gonna switch this query based on the nature of the query. We're gonna use different tools to solve it. So if it's a math problem, well, we're gonna send it over to Wolfram Alpha. We're not gonna try and use autocomplete to fix it. So I mean, is the future of AI really about how do we use programmatic AI in combination with deep learning in combination with Gen AI, and we have some kind of switchboard which will send you down the right route, depending on the query.
So there's two parts to that. I'm very pessimistic about pure large language models. I just don't think that putting more data in is going to get us where we need to go. And I have principled arguments for that I made in 2001, and I've never seen a principled answer. And those problems remain. I am optimistic that we will eventually get to much better AI. What I often think about is the fact that in the early 20th century, everybody was trying to find the molecular basis of genetics. Mendel had shown what a gene was, and they all thought it was a protein. They were all wrong. Like you had, many, many scientists for 25 years. Someone even won a Nobel Prize on a kind of wrong assumption, wrong interpretation about the tobacco virus. Um, so eventually things got sorted out. Oswald Avery did the right experiment by process of elimination, showed that genes were not proteins, even though everybody thought they were. And then it wasn't that long after that Watson and Crick, with Rosalind Franklin's involuntary help, figured out the structure of DNA. And, we can do amazing things in biology. So, 25 years, in my opinion, were lost, but eventually we got it right. That's going to happen with AI. I think the last 5 years has been a kind of a digression, a detour from the work that we actually need to do. But I think we will get there. People are already realizing that the economics are not there, the reliability is not there. At some point, there will be an appetite to do something different. It's very difficult right now to do anything different because so much resources go into this one approach that it makes it hard to, start a startup to do anything else. And expectations are too high because people want, magical AI that can answer any question, and we don't actually know how to do that with reliability right now. And there's all kinds of sociological problems, but they will be solved. And not only that, but I'm somebody who wants AI to succeed. Like I don't want Gen AI to succeed. Like I think that people running it are immoral. They steal. I've even talked about the copyright stuff. Like I'm not happy with the people that are mostly running AI right now, but I do think that AI eventually will make radical advances in medicine, radical advances in technology, like some form of AI, more like AlphaFold, and I'll connect that to your other part of your question in a second, more like AlphaFold than chatbots are really going to, be a profound advance for humanity. So am I a pessimist, optimist? I mean, depends on what time scale you're looking at, right? Um, AlphaFold is really interesting. It's not a chat bot. It has some of the technology of a large language model inside it, but it also has a lot of classical programming, like you're talking about. And it's very purpose-built to a very specific problem, which is taking a set of nucleotides and figuring out their three-dimensional shape. It's not trying to be all things. It's trying to
But
be
narrow
one
AI.
thing. It's narrow AI, which we talked a lot about in Rebooting AI, and it's a brilliant piece of narrow AI. It deserved the Nobel Prize. It's great. Um, it is part of a larger thing that we also advocated for in Rebooting AI, and that I advocated for in my 2001 book, The Algebraic Mind, which is neuro-symbolic hybrids. So neuro-symbolic hybrid, which you were talking about, is a combination of classical AI techniques and neural networks. Seems to me like the future has to go that way. The main reason it hasn't gone that way is because Jeff Hinton has been so hostile to it that he has like corrupted a whole generation of students into not considering it. And great for Demis Hassabis for not listening and building AlphaFold. If he did the kinds of things that Hinton had said, avoiding symbolic stuff, he wouldn't have built AlphaFold. Right? AlphaFold is actually the first Nobel Prize for a neurosymbolic system. Like, people aren't seeing that. I wrote about it in my Substack to try to call attention to it, but the world doesn't quite understand these issues. Now, stepping out a bit, Kahneman System 1 and System 2, which I also talked about in Kluge. But in Kluge, I called them the reflexive system and the deliberative system. Well, large language models that work very well as a reflexive System 1. They stink for doing more deliberative System 2. It's obvious that we need to complement. We have to build the System 2 stuff. And our understanding of AI is just much better on System 1 right now than it is on System 2. We have some older stuff that helps, but we don't really have the bridges to put them together. So what you were hinting at, I think, is exactly right. When we learn to blend these two approaches in a more systematic way, not just as a one-off for narrow AI for AlphaFold, but in a general way that can work across the problems that humanity wants AI to solve, that will be amazing. And it will happen. It's going to be a ways. And I will add that I wrote an article called The Next Decade in AI, an archive in 2020, and talked about why neurosymbolic AI was one step along a larger path. But it's not going to be a panacea in itself, but improvements there, I think, are a prerequisite to getting further.
So I think one of the strengths that you highlight about human reasoning and decision making is that we're really good at understanding things that are kind of out of sample, things that we have never seen before. And of course, there are people who are promoting Gen AI who say, hey, look at this. We can create a image of a unicorn on the moon, and there's nothing in our training data that has a unicorn on the moon. Look at this. We're fantastic at out of sample also. But
I have to interrupt there. Out of sample is maybe a funny term that masks something really important. It's not quite my term. It turns out, and I argued this in 1998, and I've been trying for a quarter century for people to appreciate this point. It's really fundamental. There are different kinds of generalization. Two different kinds. You could say they're both, quote, out of sample, but the nature of the generalization matters a lot. So the demonstration I made back in 1998 was I showed early neural networks, if you train them on the identity function, which is the easiest mathematical function there is, f of x equals x, and you train one of these systems on even numbers, but not all of the even numbers, it will generalize to some other even numbers. So you can say that's out of sample if you want, but I call that within training space generalization. And neural networks of the day were able to do that. But there's also further what I call out of training space generalization. That's further out of sample, if you want to use those terms. So I said, can you generalize from binary even numbers to binary odd numbers? And the answer was systematically no. That's the most important discovery I ever made. Now we call it distribution shift or something like that. It is the unsolved problem. Everything where people get their heads tied in knots and over attribute, have the gullibility effect is because people don't understand this distinction. So they see some generalization, they say, aha, the problem of generalization has been solved. But in fact, it's only been solved for the kind of like cloud of points around the ones in the data set. And you go further so that now, you're summoning your jet airplane. I mean, summoning your car in the trade show with a jet airplane and you run into it. That's because you've gone further. You've gone outside the generalization space. So the fact that you could generalize to 10 different parking lots, ordinary parking lots, doesn't mean that you can generalize to number 11 if it's totally different. That's really the fundamental problem. And
you would not want to take your Waymo to the streets of Mumbai.
You would not want to take your street Waymo to Mumbai. You wouldn't want to take your Tesla to the streets probably of Mumbai. Although the issues there are slightly different because they have different underlying mechanisms. But you are very limited in what you can do. It's out of sample. So like if Tesla already has data in Mumbai, it's fine. But if they don't have data on rickshaws, it's going to be a problem, right? They're going to run into some of them, et cetera. Or I should say I'm speculating. It depends on the exact details. So I don't know the exact problem, but I know that the general nature of the problem is always this problem of generalizing far enough away from the data. Now we're living in this world where the companies are not transparent about what the data are. So I can't, as an outsider, say exactly where you're going to fail, but I can say that the failures are going to be these weird cases that are not adequately captured in the data. And this has been going on for decades and decades. People just not seeing that. And if you're naive and you don't see the difference between these two kinds of generalizations, then you can be like, wow, look at what this amazing thing can do. It can write a limerick. Then it turns out it can't write free verse worth shit, but nobody looks. They only are like, they're blown away by the limerick, not stopping to think that there's like 2 billion limericks in the training set and nothing else. I have a friend who actually, or Ernie Davis, my co-author of Rebooting AI, actually looked at the poetry stuff. This is just a random example. And, they do poetry if it's like iambic pentameter or whatever, but you move away from the stuff that's well observed in the training set and it doesn't work. Or I don't know if you've been following these river crossing problems, classic problems like a man and a woman, or really the classic one is like a man and a goat and a wolf and some cabbage have to get across the other side. So now
Yeah.
Colin Fraser puts in a man and a woman in a boat have to get to the other side, and it makes up these crazy answers like the man goes by himself, he swims back,
Yeah.
leaving the boat there, blah, blah, blah. It makes no sense at all because you're far enough away from the training set. And in fact, the training set has such a massive attractor effect that the system gets sucked into the cases that it's seen before. Not really reasoning. It doesn't really understand what a boat is or a river or, any of the concepts that it's talking about. It just has words. It knows how those words have typically been used, and you break down.
Well, I mean, it seems like we have problems with programmatic and we have problem with deep learning. I use examples, I've taught business and law and we use, case method a lot. And, we study codes and we look for rules, but we also do cases. And, this comes up all the time in contract law, for instance. If I contract you to go and buy me something, right? And I say, here, you got to buy me this thing. And then, you get to the market and the thing's not there. Okay. Does that mean, you shouldn't, there's something that looks similar and it's for a price that's sort of like what, there's no way that you can write a contract that is fully complete, that will cover every possible contingency. And so if you try to just learn by looking at other similar cases, well, there's going to be new cases that never appear. And so it seems like neither one of those systems alone and maybe even together are going to be able to tell you what to do in that situation. It requires this extra added type of reasoning. And you walk through all of these things, right? Abstraction and structure and, compositionality and theories and causation and all that stuff. And these are things, humans, I'm not going to say that we're really good at this, but we're pretty good at it compared to the
Pretty good.
alternatives.
That's right. We're not perfect at it,
Yeah.
but we're pretty good at it. And the AI systems really just can't be trusted to do it. As a side note, a lot of people are like, well, if humans are only pretty good, isn't that good enough? And I always think of calculators. Like, I don't want a calculator that's as bad at arithmetic as I am because I'm careless and, I got other stuff on my mind and I forget to carry the one. That's why I use a calculator. If you want to delegate authority to a machine, the machine needs to work. Right. I delegate authority to an airplane when I get on the airplane, commercial airline, because I have really good reason to think it's going to get me to the other side based on, data and past history. Same thing with a calculator. I know that within the limits of the numbers that they can represent, they will always be correct 100% of the time. I cannot know that about a large language model ever. There is no guarantee ever. I don't even have percentages. Like what percent of the time will it give me truth or bullshit? And if I did, it would probably be like 20% bullshit. Some studies sort of hint at that, but it's very problem dependent. And so you can't actually give a single number. But suppose it was 20%. Like that's just not good enough for many purposes.
That's about the same as a typical intern, right?
Well, and so like one uses interns in very limited ways, and partly, one's doing a service in order to educate them. But one doesn't build one's business entirely around interns, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, I have a colleague he said, he was saying, you shouldn't even buy real estate in a college town because colleges won't exist in 5 years. Right? This is what he's saying. And, I was like, wait, hold on a second.
Yeah,
When
that's
I
not
think about what it is that we really teach in a business school, at a good business school, I mean, abstracting from all the, statistics and finance and all that, like really the things that we're trying to teach in a good business school are all the things that you articulated as uniquely human, right? I mean, the ability to know when to zoom in, when to zoom out, right? Understanding causal models, understanding, frameworks, understanding abstraction, right? And representation and these things. Like those are sort of the skills that we summarize them as common sense. I mean, I've said this for decades. I say when you come to get an MBA, you're getting a PhD in common sense. Now, I don't necessarily think that everyone earns that, but that's the goal. That's the intent. Um, I mean,
when I was
is that
teaching
is that what we
PhD.
should be training people on? Should we be like helping people to cultivate their common sense because that's the thing that's uniquely human?
That's a harder question. It's very hard to know in the long term. We're not going to get AGI in 3 years, like crazy, but we might get it in 20 years. And so if you're talking about, training a first year graduate student right now for what they should do in 20 years, I don't think we know realistically. We just don't know. I think in general, critical thinking skills are always useful. It's not just common sense, like a lot of it's scientific method and reasoning. I think the most important thing that people learn in psychology grad school is whenever you've done an experiment and you think your hypothesis works, someone clever can come up with another hypothesis and point out a control group that you haven't done. And that's a really valuable lesson. That breaks some of the confirmation bias and really raises one's level of sophistication. That's beyond common sense. It's part of scientific reasoning. Those things are incredibly useful. I think they'll still be useful in 20 years. I don't know what they'll be useful for. I have to wrap in like one or two more questions.
Okay. Well, if we turn to the book on taming Silicon Valley, I mean, this is really it's a policy book in a way, and you're making
Mm.
some proposals. And I mean, some people would say, yeah, okay, fine. This thing is like a pathogen, so we just need to develop some immunity, right? And others would say, no, 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 we need to actually have public health policies in place that will stem the infection, right? Flatten the curve. And so, why should we be viewing these as any different? I went to a talk recently where there was a lawyer, copyright lawyer, and he said, well, wait a second. Why should we be thinking about this any differently than we think about anything else? You listen to a lot of music and then you come up with a new song, and we have a way of evaluating similarity and so forth. So if the machine listens to a lot of music and comes up with a song, we can do exactly the same thing. And it's even better because we can prove that they were exposed to it when we look at the data that they used for training. I mean,
Well, we know
why
they're
do we need to
exposed to
parse?
everything. If your only issue is exposure, then we're done, right? I mean, they're trained on everything, and also they're opaque about it. Although new California law is going to require some changes around that, and new EU law. So there's no question that they're exposed to everything. There are a lot of legal issues here. You're touching on one of them. The one you're touching on is about copyright, and on copyright, I don't think fair use is going to work because this stuff is being used commercially. Uh, it's being used commercially. We know that they can, in fact, regurgitate, that they often do, that the makers can't say what is regurgitation or not. They can't do any attribution. I did some work on this last year with Reed Southland, who's an artist, and we came up with, is it this year or earlier this year? Excuse me. And we came up with these examples, like you say, um, Italian plumber, and the system gives you Mario. Right. I mean,
Mhm.
that is
Yeah.
absolute regurgitation beyond question. But more importantly, the system can't even tell you that it's doing that. And so if it does that with a photographer who's not as famous as a Nintendo character, and it regurgitates that photographer, it's not going to tell you. And so you use the thing and you're ripping off that photographer. This is no good. This is, in my view, certainly not fair use. I think the courts will side with me. I think we're going to see a replication of what we saw with Napster, where for a little while, everybody's saying information wants to be free. I love having all this free shit. And then the courts are like, no, that's not actually how copyright works. And we're going to do licensing. Well, the courts didn't say that, but we wound up doing licensing. The court said you can't do this. And then, places like Apple started streaming services. People were like, you know what? I can pay $10 a month. It's okay. I won't die. Then the artist gets something. And so, we reached a better state where there was licensing. We will absolutely do that with generative AI. It's just a matter of like how we get there in time. But more broadly, that copyright is just one of many legal issues. And there is the analog of public health issues here. I have that chart in Taming Silicon Valley. We don't have time to go through all of it, but 12 immediate risks, excuse me, of generative AI, right? There's a lot of different problems: discrimination, misinformation, et cetera. It is a public health problem. And the thing it's most a problem for is democracy. This election has been a massive exercise in misinformation, including deep fakes and stuff made by text. Generative AI is clearly making that problem worse. This is a mess. This is a cost to society. With generative AI, you have to ask, is the value to society greater than the cost to society? I'm really not sure, like genuinely not sure. Whatever we can do to mitigate those costs and make the benefits stand out more is obviously a good thing. And that does require kind of thinking about it as a public health issue.
Yeah, and you talk also about tort law, and we all know that the social media platforms are considered ISPs for the purpose of tort law protections, and there's good reasons why we should get away from that. But even if we did have tort law that applied in this situation, I mean, would it really make sense to think about? I mean, if some terrorist uses Excel to calculate their P&L, I mean, we can't sue Microsoft for terrorist activities, right? I mean,
Yeah, but
isn't this just software?
I mean, the Excel doesn't come with information about how to build a bomb, right? I mean, you can use it as calculations, but it's not going to serve as a tutor to teach you how to build a bomb. But to take one example, the latest version of GPT, according to OpenAI's own testimony, is increasing the chance of bioweapons risk. So, I do think we have to take that seriously. And I have to wrap up, but I'll make one last point, which is OpenAI said we're probably increasing bioweapons risks. And then they released it anyway. In an ideal world, they would say that, and some outsider or set of outsiders, agency or whatever, would have some ability to review that decision and say, well, tell us about the cost and benefits here. You're risking human lives by your own admission. Like, why, why is that worth it? How do you make that case? What can you do to mitigate it? That's what we do with a drug. And here it's just up to Sam Altman. Even people in his company have no say. The board has no say. It's really just his decision. And he's got dollar signs dancing in his head. And so he's going to make the decision most likely around money. And many people have left this company in the last year as this has slowly dawned on them. And meanwhile, the federal government in the U.S. has done nothing to constrain Sam Altman. There's no new law really that is going to have any consequence. This is not good. It should not be up to one, person, no matter how charismatic or how well funded they are, to decide to incur large risks to humanity. And that is exactly what he's doing, and that's exactly why I wrote the book.
Well, Gary, thanks so much for joining me. Check out this book, Taming Silicon Valley. It's amazing. If even just for the illustrations of Gen AI limitations, but also rebooting AI. It's a couple years old, which is decades in AI time. It's still extremely relevant and very interesting. But then don't forget Cluj, Birth of the Mind, Algebraic Mind, and all sorts of other great stuff. Check out the Substack. Thanks so much, Gary. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a great conversation.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.